Gary Lineker has sparked yet another BBC impartiality row, and this time it's for supporting calls for Israel's removal from international football. MPs in the Jewish community have called for the Match of the Day presenter to be sanctioned after he reposted a statement on X from a pro-Palestinian campaign demanding that Israel's banned from all global sporting bodies and tournaments until it ends its grave violations of international law. This is the latest dispute to involve the TV pundit, following comments last year comparing the government's Rwanda policy to Nazi Germany. Joining me to discuss this, Ali Ross, TV critic at The Sun, and Michael Wegier, Executive Director of the British Board of Deputies of British Jews. Thank you both for joining me. Why don't we start with you, Michael? Can you explain, what the reaction is to this latest, I don't know what you would call it, this latest salvo, you might say, of Gary Lineker's? I'm just trying to think what kind of word you would append to it, really. What are people saying? What's the feeling about it?
Well, I think there's been a bit of collective eye rolling because there's been a bit of a history of Mr. Lineker from really grandstanding, if I maybe use an old BBC footballing analogy, in that since October the 7th, when the Hamas terrorists murdered, raped and pillaged through southern Israel, we noted that he did retweet a Premier League general call for peace, but since then he has consistently posted in favour really of the other side, the supporting what's been going on from Hamas, and it's been very, very problematic. So there's a lot of eye rolling. We're very, very unhappy that he has been so one-sided in this conflict, especially now 101 days since the hostages were taken following this massacre. There's been nothing in support of the hostages. And finally, there have been two really important sports stories in the last couple of days that he's not tweeted about at all. The first is an Israeli footballer in Turkey who has now been expelled for Turkey just for drawing attention to the hostages situation. And secondly, a young Jewish cricketer who was captain of the South African under-19 cricket team, who has been stood down his role as captain, basically because he is Jewish and has got some sympathy with Israel. So the Jewish community is pretty upset, I would say, with what Mr. Lineker has done, although we do note that he has now deleted the post, which is, I think, a pretty good thing.
Let me bring Ali Ross into all of this. I mean, Ali, you're a TV critic. He's meant to be on the telly. He's meant to be commenting on sport. His area of expertise is meant to be sport. He is a very good sports commentator, or at least some people think so. I'm not sure you're his biggest fan. But this just goes on, doesn't it? None of it can possibly be accidental.
Well, we talked a couple of months ago, I think, immediately after October the 7th, and you said at the time, this is just going to get worse and worse if it's not dealt with. And this is exactly what's happened. And Michael put his finger on it there as well. Gary Lineker's conscience is very, very selective. Calling for a boycott is the easiest and dumbest thing in the world, but a real conscience involves self-sacrifice, which is what Gary Lineker didn't have when it came to hosting the World Cup in Qatar, where something like 6,700 workers had died because of a basic lack of human rights in the build-up to that tournament. But Gary Lineker, I'm sure, never considered for one moment that he wouldn't be there fronting the coverage for the BBC, when certain other pundits, to their eternal credit, refused to go to Qatar. So you have to wonder what Gary Lineker's motivation here is, and the most charitable is that it's just done in some way to provoke a reaction. But the stupidity of that is it's now been picked up by the broadcast wing of Hamas, who, let no one ever forget, prompted this whole conflict when it carried out the worst pogrom since the Second World War on October the 7th. So it's extremely, extremely irresponsible of him. And it's all right saying, well, he's deleted the tweet now, but the internet keeps receipts, and no one will ever forget his inconsistency and his hypocrisy on this matter and how dangerous it's become. And the BBC still doesn't seem to want to do anything about it, which leads me to assume they're either going to part company with him after the Euros, which, by the way, Israel can still potentially qualify for, or else he's going to quit. Either way, it would be a happy outcome, I think, because this is just ridiculous, the way this has been allowed to carry on.
I think you and I have discussed on many occasions, Ali, you know, that I worked at the BBC for about 30 years and I had innumerable contracts. They were normally renewed about once every 2 years or something like that. And one of the absolute pivotal kind of paragraphs, one you couldn't miss, it wasn't kind of lost way, way down on page 18 in the small print. It was right up there, you know, along with your name and address pretty much, was the bit that said you mustn't bring the BBC into disrepute, and that one of the ways in which you could do this would be sharing personal views on various matters, political, even that you weren't supposed to particularly espouse a particular charity in case it somehow didn't sit comfortably with what the BBC was doing. You know, but the kind of basic thrust of it, very clearly understandable to everybody who didn't need a law degree to twig this, was, you know, don't do anything that reflects badly on the BBC. Just get on with your job and do it. That's what you're paid for. And in his case, paid more than anybody else in the entire country to do it.
Exactly.
So is this, some people have suggested to me, maybe this is an absurd and inane conspiracy theory, but some people have suggested he might want to get thrown out by the BBC and that would make him a cause célèbre and he would like to be one of those.
Well, I wouldn't dismiss the idea out of hand. He's certainly got one hell of an ego on him, because, as you say, he's put himself and his own opinions ahead of the BBC, which created a career for him. And once you take away that neutrality, there is no point of the BBC. It ceases to have a proper function as a state broadcaster. But the problem here from the start, from October the 7th onwards, is that it just hasn't led with any moral authority on this issue, up to the point where it hasn't even quite been able to bring itself to call Hamas terrorists, which they most clearly are.
I mean, one of the extraordinary facets of all of this, I think, is the BBC deciding to take a stand, Michael. And I bet you know which stand I'm going to decide to choose here. The BBC really did kind of stand up and rattle its sabre and make its views known when it came to stopping staff who worked in news or current affairs attending the March Against Anti-Semitism, which is simply another way of saying a march against racism. It's an anti-racism march. That's what it was. And they said that their news and current affairs staff could not march against anti-Semitism. They really did stand up and say that with great assertiveness. I just wonder what your reaction was to that when the BBC had been so incredibly insipid about virtually everything else.
So we were pretty unhappy about that situation, and we are very aware that there are many Jews working in the BBC who were not happy with that policy and are organising to really become a network, and the Board of Deputies is very happy to be supportive of that network. And we know that many Jews from the BBC attended the rally and subsequent rallies that have been organised, rallies before, rallies after. I do want to say that we don't think that the BBC is an anti-Semitic organisation. That is absolutely not the policy of the Board of Deputies. We do think there have been some problems in their news coverage, and the BBC had the Board of Deputies had a very significant case against the BBC about the reporting of an attack on a bus, which many of your viewers will remember from about just over a year ago.
I do, but I don't think there's any need to go back so far in history when everything is so incredibly vivid and so immediate since October the 7th. To rehash the story of the bus, I don't think is even necessary. That's an old story. What about now? What about what you think now, not what you thought then?
We are not happy with much of the coverage from the BBC. We are very concerned about the coverage of BBC Arabic, and that's really been a problem there. And of course, there have been problems from the BBC and many other media outlets about their reporting. We are very mindful that there was a ceasefire in place until October the 7th. That ceasefire was broken by Hamas in the most brutal way, as your other interviewee just mentioned, and all reporting of the conflict between Israel and Hamas now needs to bear that in mind consistently. There are 130 Israeli citizens being held by Hamas who need to be released immediately. Hamas can bring this conflict to an end today by releasing the hostages and laying down their arms. And any news coverage that does not highlight that issue is frankly not doing their work properly.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.